A village garden hides a secret salted long before the murder. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Tell me where you're joining from. I love hearing your stories. Now, let's uncover the truth. The summer evening had settled over St. Aldred's, with a kind of golden warmth that made the village look like something from an old watercolor. Gardens glowed under the low sun, and the scent of lavender drifted through the lanes. In the vicarage garden, where roses clustered thickly against the stone walls, a small gathering was underway. The Reverend Pemberton had decided to host his annual midsummer tea, a tradition of polite conversation, sponge cake, and the faintly competitive display of who could produce the most impressive strawberries. Miss Marple, invited as always, sat comfortably in a wicker chair near the long table, her knitting needles flashing faintly in the fading light. She rarely spoke unless addressed, though her pale blue eyes missed very little. She noted the peculiar way Mrs. Carter avoided meeting the gaze of Mrs. Vane, how young Martin Larch kept glancing at the lane beyond the hedge, and how Mrs. Pemberton, though smiling, clutched her teacup with fingers tight enough to whiten the knuckles. It was after the second pot of tea had been poured and the sponge cake half eaten that the evening altered. The Reverend, in the middle of describing his attempts at growing climbing beans, was interrupted by a sharp cry from the far end of the garden. Heads turned toward the withered plot near the wall, once a flourishing corner of tulips and delphiniums, now an oddly neglected patch, brittle and dry despite the season's warmth. Mrs. Hardwick, the housekeeper, stood there, her hands trembling. "Reverend, you'd best come." The guests gathered, murmuring, as the Reverend and two of the younger men hurried forward. The withered plants had been roughly trampled, and in their midst, half hidden beneath the tangled stems, was something pale. It was the face of a woman. Gasps and whispers rose at once. The vicar's voice, tight and strained, ordered everyone back. But Miss Marple, leaning slightly on her cane as she approached, saw enough in those first moments to understand that the peace of St. Aldred's had just been quietly shattered. No one spoke her name, but she knew the face. And she also knew, though she could not yet have said why, that the withered garden had been chosen for a reason. For a long breath, the garden seemed to hold itself perfectly still. The usual village noises, distant hens, a cart on the green, the murmurous drift of talk, went quite away, as if drawn off by invisible hands. Someone dropped a spoon. The tiny clatter made two ladies flinch as though it had been a shot. The Reverend Pemberton crossed himself without realizing it, and then, remembering the practicalities that fall to a host, turned wretchedly to the housekeeper. "Mrs. Hardwick, ring the police at once, and please, no one must go wandering." No one did at first. They stood in an uneven crescent, all those familiar faces suddenly arranged as if for a tableau, the withered plot before them like a dark stage. The face among the dead stems looked oddly untroubled, which made it worse. Miss Marple leaned her weight on her cane, not from age so much as from habit when there was something to be studied. She did not step forward. There was nothing to be gained in thrusting oneself at the scene while the air still trembled with discovery. It is remarkable what the air remembers in the first few minutes. Who gasped first? Who did not? What was said aloud, and what was very carefully left unsaid? Mrs. Pemberton, her fingers still curved foolishly round the empty teacup, whispered, "Oh, dear Lord." And then, after a beat, "Isn't that Miss Truelove?" It was said tentatively, as if the name might alter the fact. Miss Marple had recognized the girl at once, though she was no more than a recent figure in St. Aldred's. A pale young woman with an anxious mouth and quick, pretty hands, lately come to lodge in Mrs. Vane's spare room. Lydia Truelove, who had been helping Mr. Carter in the solicitor's office by copying leases and letters. She had a habit of slipping out of the village after supper and returning by the lower lane, and there had been, as there always were, remarks. Mrs. Carter made a choking sound, covered it with her handkerchief, and said into the linen, "How perfectly dreadful." Her eyes did not meet Mrs. Vane's. Mrs. Vane, whose calm was of the sort one puts on like a scarf, stood quite straight, pale but composed, her fingers resting lightly together as if she were waiting to be measured for gloves. Young Martin Larch looked sick. The boy had the blanched look of those who are astonished to find the world includes more than cricket and bicycles. He peered toward the gate again, as if help might come rumbling up the lane on cue. Miss Marple's gaze fell, not to the face, but to the earth. The plants had been killed in no natural way. Even in July, one might have a corner that sulked from too much shade or bad soil. But this had the scorched, grayish look of deliberate ruin. Salt left a crust sometimes, or weed killer left by a heavy hand. She saw a brittle powder on the surface and an odd whiteness where stems had broken. Her eye went at once to the border where healthy growth met the blighted square. And there, in the seam, a slip of sea-green ribbon had tangled itself on a dead stalk. A ridiculous frivolity in a vicarage garden. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and saw that a very fine, cheap ribbon, like the sort used on a hat from the draper's, had frayed at the end and given a single thread to the stem. The Reverend moved forward at last, then thought better of it, and turned the guests back with a grave little gesture. "If you please," he said, and his voice was almost steady. "We shall wait on the authorities." To Mrs. Pemberton he said in a lower voice, "The girls might be brought into the study. Tea will help." Tea is a determined thing. Within 5 minutes, shaken faces had cups in their hands, and sugar was being offered with the polite, mechanical solicitousness of people who cannot yet accept that the day has broken from its course. The vicarage drawing-room smelled of lavender polish and old sermons. Its orderliness felt indecent. Miss Marple took her place on a small chintz sofa near the window. From there she could see the lawn, the white tablecloth lifted faintly by a breeze, and beyond it the corner of ruin where the withered garden lay. Mrs. Hardwick had gone to the telephone in the hall and returned with a nod that said the call had been made. "Do they know who she is?" Martin burst out. He colored when the ladies looked at him. "I mean, only I've seen her at the post office sometimes." "Miss Truelove," Mrs. Vane said evenly. "Lydia Truelove. She was lodging with me." There was a fractional pause at the was, as if the grammar hurt in her mouth. Miss Marple's eyes rested a second on the woman's composed profile. Perfectly calm, almost too calm. But then, some women were like that. They went white and silent and saved their crying for when the bedchamber door had shut. "It's a terrible business," Mrs. Carter murmured, and added, as if the matter were purely practical, "I fear my husband will be required." "The police will see to it," Mrs. Pemberton said, with a firmness she did not feel. "Mrs. Vane, dear, can I send someone for... Did she have any..." "No family here," Mrs. Vane said. "An aunt in Bath. The name is Peg. She came to me by the notice Mr. Carter posted for temporary clerical help." Her eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, to Mrs. Carter's lap and the hand that clenched the handkerchief there. "She had excellent references," she added. "References," Mrs. Carter said lightly, with the smile of a woman who despised poor, thin words. "One never knows." Miss Marple made a small, swift image of the group. Who leaned in, who leaned away, who was quick to offer explanations and who produced none. People are very like their gardens. One sees which plants are apt to strangle their neighbors if left to themselves, and which will droop for want of attention. She noticed, too, that Mrs. Pemberton's hands had stopped shaking once there were tasks to put between herself and the thing outside. That was a kind of courage. They heard the motor first, then the crunch of tires on the gravel. Sergeant Burroughs, a thick-set man with pink skin and earnest eyes, came through the gate and took off his hat with something like reverence. With him was Inspector Leonard Briggs from Melchester, spare and dry, with a way of seeing a room as a list. He was polite, which often made him more formidable than he would otherwise be. "Ladies, Reverend." Heaker listened to the Reverend's brief account, said twice without warmth, and then went down on his haunches by the withered corner. Sergeant Burroughs took notes, his pencil moving as if it had decided in advance what lines it would accept on the page. "No one touch anything," Briggs said mildly, which was unnecessary but ritual. He peered, not at the face, but at the outline of crushed stems and the earth's crust. Odd place for a body. Miss Truelove was not a frequent visitor to my garden. The Reverend said, a little stiff with the shame of novelty. "If that is your meaning." "Rarely people lie down of their own accord among the vicarage delphiniums," Briggs said, and looked at the Reverend so quickly it made the clergyman blink. He shifted his attention to the damaged bed. "When did these plants sicken?" Mrs. Pemberton clasped her hands again. "Over 3 weeks ago, Inspector. I thought it blight. The Reverend said we should dig it out in autumn and replant. We had been watering, but it did no good." 3 weeks, Briggs repeated. He ran a finger over the grayish surface, examined the residue, and did not taste it. He was not that sort of inspector. "Sergeant, note a white efflorescence. Soil appears desiccated. Possible salt, or weed killer strong. Who here tends the garden?" "Mrs. Hardwick and I," Mrs. Pemberton said, "and old Mr. Appleby twice a week. He is 87 and much attached to his secateurs." "Salt is cheap," Miss Marple said gently, almost to herself. "And the weather does oblige a person by drying one's mistakes." Inspector Briggs's head turned slightly. He had dealt with Miss Marple before, in a business of a charwoman and a keepsake that had made him alter his report in the end. "Indeed, ma'am." "Oh, it is only that gardeners do altogether human things in corners," Miss Marple said, her eyes at the withered earth. "And sometimes other human things occur where the plants make a screen." "Screen," Briggs repeated, as if committing the word to a pocket. "Who found the body?" "I did, sir," Mrs. Hardwick said stoutly from the path. "I came to fetch the folding chairs we keep by the wall, on account of the Reverend liking to have enough when folks stay on of a summer evening. I saw her in among the dead stems. Like a doll someone has made cross, if you please, begging pardon." Her voice trembled only at the end. "And you did not move anything. Good. Reverend, we'll want to speak to everyone present, and to anyone who departed before the discovery." "No one is left," the Reverend said, and his glance went around the drawing room like a shepherd's dog. "We are all still here." "Except Miss Truelove," Martin Larch said, and blushed again as if he had been impertinent. Inspector Briggs looked at him with a dry, small interest. "Your name, lad?" "Martin Larch. I've a bicycle." It came out as if the bicycle were a qualification. "I can go for anyone you want." "You may sit," Briggs said, and went on to Mrs. Vane. "You lodged Miss Truelove?" "Yes." No embellishment. For 6 weeks now. And her habits? Quiet, Mrs. Vane said. She rose early. She had, I think, little money. But she was very precise about paying. She went to the office mornings and sometimes afternoons when Mr. Carter required it. She wrote at night in her room, and she walked after supper. Walked where? The lower lane, toward the old mill. Sometimes as far as the stile behind the churchyard. She preferred not to be remarked upon. I don't mean anything by it. She was shy. Mrs. Carter said, with a faultless domestic smile, "Shy girls are sometimes more ambitious than they seem." She caught Miss Marple looking at her and colored faintly, an intelligent woman ignobly aware of having said too much. Inspector Briggs asked the Reverend to take him to his study for names and addresses. This broke the spell in the drawing room. People moved and breathed again and, after the manner of company, made themselves smaller by pretending to be busy. Miss Marple rose carefully and asked Mrs. Pemberton, quite mildly, if she might go out for a moment with her knitting, since the air of the house had grown close. She did not want the garden to lose its early testimony. "Only don't go near that corner, Jane," Mrs. Pemberton said. And the use of the Christian name was both apology and plea. Miss Marple went to the lawn, knitting uncannily even in such weather. Knitting is a license. One can pause where others feel obliged to walk and can look without seeming to look. She seated herself on a little iron bench under the pear tree, some 10 yards from the withered bed, and listened to the inspector's soft instructions. The sergeant was measuring footmarks. There were a muddle of them from the party itself, summer sandals and the vicar's crepe soles, and over all of it, nothing very distinct. That is the blessing and the mischief of a gathering. The ground is made common. But something at the edge of the bed, where the unspoilt lawn met the barren square, had a pattern Miss Marple recognized from village life more than from detective novels. A faint, regular pricking in the earth, as if a woman's heel had been tapped once, twice in impatience, sharp, narrow, not much weight. And beside that the smallest oval depression, not made by footwear at all, but by something set down and lifted cautiously. She leaned a little, and the wool slipped from her needles as she contrived to drop it. Bending to retrieve it, she saw the thing for what it was, an impression left by a small, round vanity compact. The sort with a mirror, kept in the pocket of a cardigan and set down while one adjusts a hat ribbon gone limp in the evening air. She let the wool slip again, once more, to see if she imagined the gilt glint near a stalk. She did not. There, almost swallowed by the gray soil, was a fine metal pin, no longer than her little finger. Not a hat pin. Those were longer and more brutal. This had a novelty head, a tiny enamel forget-me-not, very bright. Miss Marple did not pick it up. The police must have their turn, and they would prefer it not be plucked like a goose feather by an old woman, however clean her mind. There was a sweetness on the air that did not belong to roses. Violets, artificial. She knew the scent from the boxes at Mr. Perks's shop, favored by girls who wished to afford Paris in Wiltshire for 9d. It clung in the heat oddly, made richer by the ghost of the ruined bed. Miss Marple's eye moved from the frayed sea-green thread she had noticed earlier to Mrs. Vane and then to Mrs. Carter. The latter wore no ribbon of any kind. She did not go in for ornaments unless they were proper ones. Mrs. Vane's hat that afternoon had a band of black grosgrain. No sea-green there. But Lydia Truelove had twice passed Miss Marple in the lane of an evening with a little felt hat, very simply trimmed by her own hand. And there had been a scandalous, pretty ribbon that did not quite match the rest of her thrift. Inspector Briggs finished outside and returned to the drawing room for his rounds. He was good at it, Miss Marple thought. He allowed the silence to work for him and did not fear letting it sit. He asked about the hours of the tea, who poured, who fetched the extra napkins, which servant had gone into the kitchen at 4:45. He inquired very mildly if anyone had seen Miss Truelove at the tea. No one had. It had been assumed she was indoors at Mrs. Vane's, or on some errand for Mr. Carter. Mrs. Vane said she had left after luncheon to take a walk and had not returned to change before tea. "And did Miss Truelove know our vicarage garden?" Briggs asked. "She would have passed the hedge 100 times," Mrs. Pemberton said. "But come into it. Number Miss Marple did not contradict her friend. The thing is not what a girl has done, but what someone else would think she might do." Martin Larch, questioned about his earlier nervousness, confessed in a rush that he had promised to lend Miss Truelove a paperback novel about a lake in Italy, which she had admired at the village shop. And he had been hoping the post van would bring it in time. "It's silly," he said, grave with the dignity of youth. "I only wanted to be nice." "No harm in that," Inspector Briggs said, and Miss Marple approved of him a little more. Mr. Carter arrived then, called for by a small boy sent flying down the lane. He was a careful man with a lawyer's regard for touching nothing, and a husband's regard for where his wife's eyes were. He offered himself up to the inspector with a neatness one did not quite like. "She was efficient," he said of Miss Truelove. "She was temporary. She had a steady hand and a pretty way with the typewriter. I engage girls when I must. There is nothing romantic in typing." And then, injudiciously, he added, "My wife did not care for her." Mrs. Carter had the grace not to pretend at once. "She irritated me," she said coolly, as if daring anyone to call that a crime. "She was one of those poor women who present poverty like a mirror that makes one's own comfort look vulgar. I had the impression, no, the feeling, that she collected confidences as other girls collect postcards. But for what purpose I cannot say." "For security," Miss Marple murmured, and when the inspector's eyebrows lifted, she smiled at him. "People who have been adrift sometimes take up little anchors. They are not heavy, but there are many of them." Inspector Briggs took a long breath. "We will have the doctor from Much Benham, and we will have the body moved when he says so. Until then, I require that no one leave the vicarage. Sergeant, keep the gate. Reverend, if I might trouble you for a private word." The drawing room rearranged itself in his absence. Mrs. Vane came to Miss Marple's bench and stood, not sitting, as if some strict governess had told her it would be unladylike to crease the skirt. "Miss Marple," she said very quietly, "if I say something to you, would you keep it until you think it useful?" "If it is kind," Miss Marple said, "and true." Mrs. Vane's mouth tightened. "She had a letter yesterday. From Bath, I think?" There was a stamp of a shop in Milsom Street. "She was upset after she read it. She told me she would have done better to burn what she had burned years ago. Only she had kept a copy, and copies are as dangerous as originals. I did not understand it at the time." Miss Marple filed this away, next to the sea-green ribbon and the violet scent. "And did she go out last night?" "Yes," Mrs. Vane said. "She returned later than usual. Her shoes were muddy and she went very softly on the stairs. This morning she was pale and a little exalted, if you know what I mean. As if she had done something that had lifted a weight and had not yet considered what weight would settle in its place." Miss Marple nodded. She knew that feeling well. The most dangerous hour after a decision is the one in which one is light with relief. People promise, or confess, or visit with a frankness that is almost cheerful. "And one more thing," Mrs. Vane said, very low. She asked me if sea green was becoming to her complexion. I told her it made her look like river water. Truthful, Miss Marple said gravely, and not perhaps what was wanted. The doctor came and went, and there were murmurs of times that would be recorded, of bruises that might mean this and might mean that. Miss Marple heard between 4 and 5 as a conjecture, and stored it with the neatness of a housekeeper putting away linen. The inspector took possession of Miss Truelove's little handbag, which had been found beside the hedge, and weighed in, his palm a cheap compact with a mirror, upon which there clung a whitish smear that might have been powder and might have been something more domestic like flour. He made no play of it. He simply put it in an envelope, and his face did not so much as flicker when Mrs. Carter watched that motion with the fixed interest of someone assembling a thought she did not wish to acknowledge. When at last the necessary solemnities were concluded, and the vicar, white as his collar, offered a last quavering blessing, the inspector permitted the ladies to be escorted home. They left in little troops of 2s and 3s, the way birds leave a wire together, and then remember they have separate directions. Mrs. Vane stood for a moment at the gate, looked back at Miss Marple, and then went up the lane. Mrs. Carter went the other way, bright as silver in the fading light, her head held with a care that said she had reached some inward conclusion and did not wish it to spill. Miss Marple remained. The garden, minus its withered corner, had recovered something like its former character. She looked at the dead patch with a dry, almost pitying regard. You were ruined first, she thought, and that made you useful. She did not need to tell Inspector Briggs what she had seen. She would, when it could be heard. For the present, she asked, in her most apologetic voice, whether she might look by the gate. He obliged her with a nod. Gates are indiscreet places. They are the bits of a boundary that behave like a person. There, in the gravel, she found a tiny scrap of torn paper, damp at the corner where it had stuck to a shoe. She bent and teased it up with her needle. A printed heading in a crisp, modern type. Milsom Street. Below it, 2 words only, the rest torn away. Copy enclosed. Miss Marple smiled, the thinnest possible smile. Copies. Anchors. Ribbons chosen for other people's eyes. And a garden killed before any body lay in it. Killed carefully, like a stage set one has weeks to prepare. That, too, was a kind of anchor. Someone had chosen this corner far in advance. Someone had made their screen before there was a scene to hide. The following morning dawned with the deceptive brightness of a summer day that wishes to be ordinary. Sunlight poured through the net curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room in the limes, picking out the gleam on her polished teapot and the faint dust on the mantelpiece she meant to see to later. The little square of her breakfast table was neatly set, though her mind was on neither marmalade nor toast. She had been awake since 5, lying still beneath her counterpane, letting the facts move in her mind without forcing them into an arrangement. It is best, she knew, to let such things settle of their own accord, like tea leaves in the bottom of a cup. Disturbed too soon, they give you nothing but cloudy water. The image of the withered garden had returned often in the night. Not the poor, pale face among the stems. Miss Marple was long past the point of allowing such sights to keep her from sleep, but the deliberate ruination of the plot itself. She had seen gardens given over to neglect, to frost, to rabbits, to children's feet. This was none of those. This was prepared ground, laid waste in advance. And the question that kept circling was a simple one. Why would someone kill the garden before they had any use for it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a light rap on her door. When she opened it, there stood young Martin Larch, hat in hand, looking rather as if he'd come to confess something at school. "Morning, Miss Marple." My mum says I should see if you want anything fetched from the shop. I'm going anyway." She thanked him and asked him to wait a moment while she found her list. It was a short list. Just tea, sugar, and some seed cake if Mrs. Finch still had any left. But it gave her an excuse to keep him there. "And how is your morning, Martin?" she asked mildly as she wrote. "All right," he said, but with the slight hitch of a boy who is not all right at all. "It's a funny thing, though. They say Miss Truelove, she was, well, the doctor says not very long dead when they found her. That's what I heard when I took the milk to the post office. They don't know why she was in the vicarage garden at all. People go where they are invited," Miss Marple said, "or where they think they may not be noticed." He frowned at that, turning it over. "Do you think she was meeting someone?" Miss Marple gave him one of her vague little smiles. "I think people often meet one another without intending to be seen. The question is whether they come away again. Thank you for doing my errand, Martin. And keep your eyes open. Not everything one overhears is gossip. Sometimes it's a fact looking for an ear." She closed the door gently and went to her writing desk. It was no use waiting for the inspector to call. He had his own order of business. But she could, without much trouble, go into the village and make a circuit that would take her past both Mrs. Vane's and the Carters' houses. Not to pry, of course, simply to see. It was still early enough for the high street to smell of fresh bread from Mr. Perks's bakery. Miss Marple took her time. At Mrs. Vane's, the curtains were half drawn, though the sun was already bright. The front door was firmly shut. No one answered when she tapped the brass knocker, and she did not knock twice. People in grief, or in other conditions, do not always welcome a neighbor at breakfast. At the Carters' house, she had better fortune. Mrs. Carter herself opened the door, looking as though she had been up for hours. She was dressed impeccably for so early in the day. Blue linen, a small brooch, hair fixed as if for a committee meeting. "Miss Marple," she said, the name an acknowledgement rather than a welcome. "I thought I would see how you were keeping," Miss Marple said gently. "Such an unpleasant business yesterday." Mrs. Carter's eyes flickered, and she half laughed. "It is unpleasant, yes. But I am not one to fall into vapors over a stranger. If anything, I am sorry for her, such a waste, being young and all." "And you knew her very little?" "Barely at all," Mrs. Carter replied too quickly. "She worked for my husband, of course, but our paths hardly crossed." Miss Marple inclined her head, as though accepting this. "And Mr. Carter? He must feel it more keenly, having seen her day to day." "My husband," Mrs. Carter said, each word clipped, "is not in the habit of letting clerks become a personal concern." She gave a brittle smile. "You're wondering if I was jealous, Miss Marple. That would be rather old-fashioned of me." Miss Marple did not deny it. Old-fashioned things have a way of returning, Mrs. Carter. Like brooches, one thinks out of style until one sees them worn again. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed just a fraction, but she said nothing more. She excused herself on the grounds of a meeting with the church flower committee, and Miss Marple allowed herself to be seen out. From there she made her way to the vicarage, where the gate now bore a little notice from the police. "No entry without permission." The Reverend Pemberton came to meet her, looking 10 years older than the day before. "Inspector Briggs has been most thorough," he said, after the polite preliminaries. "He's taken statements from everyone, and they've been over the garden like gleaners. Mrs. Hardwick is beside herself, poor soul. She keeps saying it will take months to make the bed right again." 3 weeks, Reverend," Miss Marple said mildly. "It has been ruined for 3 weeks already." The Reverend blinked. "Well, yes. But that was before yesterday. She let that hang in the air a moment, then asked if she might walk the side path. He hesitated, then agreed, following her down the gravel track that led to the back gate. The police had been tidy. The only signs of their work were a few stakes marking the borders of the Withered plot and some faint chalk numbers in the grass. Miss Marple paused at the bench under the pear tree. "Did Miss Truelove ever visit here in the evenings?" "Not that I recall," the Reverend said, though my wife might know better. She and Mrs. Vane were on visiting terms. If she did come, it would not have been for my company, I assure you. And the garden? Did you notice anyone showing particular interest in that corner before it was blighted? He frowned, thinking. Now that you say it, I do recall Mrs. Carter remarking on it at the Whitsun fete. She said it would make a fine spot for a garden seat if only the flowers could be persuaded to grow better. But that was before the trouble with the soil. Miss Marple filed this neatly in her mind, along with the ribbon, the scent, and the scrap of letter. She made no outward sign of it beyond a small nod. "You must be very weary, Reverend. I shall not keep you." As she walked back into the village, she caught sight of Martin again, cycling furiously toward her. He skidded to a halt, breathless. "Miss Marple, you said to keep my eyes open. I was at the shop and Mrs. Finch said there was a man in there this morning asking about ribbons, sea green ones. Said he needed a yard or two to match something. She didn't have any in stock, so she sent him to the drapers in Melchester." "Did she know him?" "Never seen him before. Tall chap, dark hair, bit of a scar on his chin. She thought he might be staying at the inn." Miss Marple thanked him and sent him on his way. A stranger buying sea green ribbon the morning after Lydia Truelove was found dead, wearing no hat at all. It was curious. Curious enough to warrant a word with Inspector Briggs before someone slipped out of St. Aldred's on the noon bus. She found him in the small office the constable used, a cramped room smelling faintly of ink and damp paper. He looked up from his notes when she entered. "You've something for me, Miss Marple?" "Only a small thing. Mrs. Finch tells me a man was asking after sea green ribbon this morning. Tall, dark-haired, scar on the chin. She sent him to Melchester." Briggs's eyes sharpened. "That's worth knowing. We found a scrap of green thread at the scene. Thought it was nothing much. Did your keen eyes see more in it?" Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile. "Only that ribbons are like words, Inspector. They may be common, but the particular shade and the moment one needs them, that can be very particular indeed." He sat back, thoughtful. "We'll see if the inn's had such a lodger, and we'll ask at Melchester if he bought his ribbon." Miss Marple took her leave, content to let the inspector follow the thread for now. There were other matters she meant to attend to. Quietly, without the formality of statements. For one thing, she wished to see if Mrs. Vane might be persuaded to show her Miss Truelove's room. And for another, she had an idea about that artificial violet scent, and where in the village one might purchase such a thing without drawing notice. As she turned down the lane toward Mrs. Vane's, she caught a flicker of movement at an upstairs window. A face, there and gone again, watching her approach. Whether it had been Mrs. Vane or someone else entirely, she could not yet say. But she thought she knew now that Lydia Truelove's death had been in the making for longer than anyone realized, and that the Withered garden was only the first part of a plan that had taken shape well before the tea party was ever arranged. The real question was whose plan it had been, and who was clever enough to carry it out under the very noses of St. Aldred's. Mrs. Vane opened the door herself this time, and though her voice was polite enough, her eyes held that faint wariness of a person who suspects a visitor has come for more than pleasantries. Miss Marple thought she looked a shade paler than the day before, though perhaps it was only the dimness of the hall, where the blinds had been drawn halfway against the morning glare. "Good morning, Mrs. Vane. I wondered if I might have a word, and perhaps, if it's not an imposition, a glance at Miss Truelove's room. It occurred to me she may have left some clue as to why she was in the vicarage garden." Mrs. Vane hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course, though I can't imagine what you'll find. The inspector has already looked." "Inspectors look for certain things," Miss Marple said mildly. "Sometimes a landlady notices others." The room was at the back of the house, small but very neat, with a view over the lane and the orchard beyond. The bed was made with a precision that suggested it had been left untouched since the girl last rose from it. On the dresser stood a modest collection of personal items: a comb, a small bottle of scent with a violet on the label, a worn leather-bound notebook, and a pin tray containing 2 hat pins and a cheap gilt brooch. Miss Marple's attention went at once to the scent. She removed the stopper and held it briefly to her nose. Artificial violets, just as she had suspected, sweet and heavy, a little cloying. Did she wear this often? "Every day," Mrs. Vane said. "I sometimes thought it was too strong for her, but she liked it. And the ribbon she trimmed her hat with, do you know where she bought it?" "In Melchester, I believe. She was pleased to find just the shade she wanted. I thought it rather frivolous. Sea green is not a practical color. It fades." Miss Marple glanced at the notebook. "May I?" Mrs. Vane nodded. The pages were mostly filled with tidy lines of copied quotations, bits from novels, a few from poetry. But tucked into the back was a single folded sheet, written in a sharper hand. The ink had smudged slightly, as if blotted in haste. It read, "If you still have the copy, destroy it. You have no idea what trouble it may bring you." I was wrong to think you could be trusted with it. There was no signature. "Did she mention this?" Miss Marple asked. "Number. But she received it yesterday. It came in the second post. She read it in the parlor, turned quite white, and went up to her room without a word. Later she came down and asked me, quite out of the blue, if I thought sea green suited her. I told you that yesterday." "Yes," Miss Marple said, folding the paper and replacing it exactly where she had found it. "Did she go out again after that?" "In the evening, yes. I heard her leave by the side door. She did not return until late. I was still up, reading, and she came in quietly, as if she didn't want to disturb me." "Or as if she didn't want you to see her," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Vane gave her a quick, searching look. "You think she was hiding something?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that she was in some sort of difficulty and had not yet decided how to manage it." When she left Mrs. Vane's, Miss Marple took the longer way round toward the high street, passing the village inn. The tap room was empty at this hour, save for the landlord polishing glasses behind the counter. "Morning, Mr. Hales," she said pleasantly. "I hear you've had some visitors in the village lately." "1 or 2, Hales admitted. "Had a chap in last night, tall, dark hair, scar on his chin. Said he'd come from Melchester way, quiet fellow. Didn't say much, but he left early this morning, before breakfast." "And where was he bound?" Hales shrugged. "Didn't say. But he asked about buses to Melchester and Exeter. Said he had business in one or the other. Left his key on the bar." "Did you notice what he was wearing?" "A gray suit, nothing remarkable. But he had a parcel, brown paper tied with string, looked about a yard long." "A parcel the size of a length of ribbon, perhaps," Miss Marple suggested. Hales laughed. Could be, though I'm no judge of ladies' trimmings. From the inn she walked to Mrs. Finch's shop. The baker's wife was at the counter, but Mrs. Finch herself emerged from the back, wiping her hands on her apron. "I was told you had a gentleman in yesterday, asking after sea green ribbon," Miss Marple said. "That's right. He was in quite a hurry about it. I told him I'd none in stock, and he looked put out. Said it had to match something exactly." "Did he say what?" "No, but he kept glancing out the window as if expecting someone. Then he thanked me and went on to the draper's in Melchester." Miss Marple bought a small loaf and some biscuits, then took her leave. It was clear the man had wanted the ribbon urgently. The question was whether he had wanted it for himself or to replace something that might be missed. By midday, she was back at the Limes, where she found a note pushed under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar. "Please meet me by the stile at the edge of the orchard at 3 o'clock. I have something you should see. MLML could only be Martin Larch." She arrived at the stile a few minutes before the hour, finding Martin waiting with a paper-wrapped bundle under his arm. "I didn't want to bring this to your house," he said. "I found it this morning, behind the shed at the cricket field. I was looking for my ball and saw something white sticking out from under some boards." He handed her the bundle. Inside was a small felt hat, crushed and stained, the sea-green ribbon frayed at one end. The crown bore a faint mark as if it had been ground into the earth. "Where exactly did you find it?" Miss Marple asked. "Just behind the shed. There's a path there that goes toward the lower lane. I reckon someone could have come from the vicarage that way, if they wanted to." Miss Marple examined the ribbon closely. A single dark thread was caught in the weave, coarse, almost like the fibers of a gardener's glove. She folded the hat back into the paper and told Martin to say nothing of it to anyone. That evening, she sent a note to Inspector Briggs, requesting a word. When he came, she laid the hat on her table. "Found by the cricket field," she told him. "Close enough to the vicarage for someone to pass unseen if they knew the way. I think it may have been torn from Miss Truelove's head before she was placed in the garden. The frayed ribbon suggests it." Briggs examined it with a frown. "You're thinking the ribbon fragment at the scene came from this?" "Yes. And I think whoever removed the hat wanted to dispose of it before it could be seen." "And the man at the inn?" "Could have been trying to replace the ribbon, to make some other hat appear unchanged." Briggs nodded slowly. "It's a long shot, but I'll have the shed area looked at properly, and I'll see if we can trace our tall gentleman." After he left, Miss Marple sat a while with her knitting untouched in her lap. The pattern was beginning to take shape now, not yet clear enough to name the killer, but enough to know that Lydia Truelove's death had been planned well in advance. The Withered garden was no chance hiding place. It had been made ready for its grim purpose. And somewhere in that preparation lay the key to the whole affair. The next step, she decided, would be to learn exactly what Miss Truelove had kept. A copy that someone in Bath had begged her to destroy. Whatever it was, it had been dangerous enough to kill for. And Miss Marple intended to find it before the killer realized it was missing. The next morning, Miss Marple set out for the post office, under the perfectly ordinary pretext of sending a parcel to her niece in London. The packet, neatly wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, contained nothing more than a tin of homemade ginger biscuits, but it served as a convenient cover for her true purpose: to inquire, casually of course, about Miss Truelove's recent correspondence. The postmistress, Mrs. Grover, was a brisk, narrow-faced woman with a fondness for knowing who sent what to whom and when. To Miss Marple's polite inquiry about the reliability of the second post, she responded with an approving nod and then volunteered exactly what Miss Marple had hoped to hear. "Yes, we've had a fair bit of second post lately, what with summer visitors and such. And Miss Truelove, poor girl, she had a letter in the second post just the day before. Well, before the trouble." Mrs. Grover lowered her voice, although there was no one else in the shop. "Came from Bath, it did. Recognized the frank mark, Milsom Street. I remember because it looked a smart envelope, not the sort she usually got. She took it with a bit of a face, if you ask me. Went straight off toward Mrs. Vane's without another word." Miss Marple made a small sound of sympathy. "And did she ever send letters to Bath?" "Once or twice, always by registered post, which isn't cheap. I remember she sent one just last week. Same Frank would have come back, I shouldn't wonder." That confirmed something Miss Marple had already suspected. The letter she'd seen in Miss Truelove's room, with its warning about destroying a copy, must have been an answer to something the girl had sent first. But what was the copy? A document, a photograph, a letter. And why would anyone go to such lengths to ensure it was gone? She left the post office and strolled toward the green, where the weekly market was in full swing. It was there she spotted Mrs. Hardwick, the vicarage housekeeper, haggling over a punnet of strawberries. Miss Marple joined her with a gentle greeting, and after a few pleasantries about the weather and the price of fruit, she steered the conversation, ever so delicately, toward the garden. "Such a pity about the withered bed," she murmured. "I always thought it such a pretty corner when it was in bloom." Mrs. Hardwick pursed her lips. "Pretty enough, but it's been nothing but trouble these past weeks. No matter how much I watered, the plants just died off, and the Reverend wouldn't hear of digging it up before autumn." She shook her head. "Now I think of it, there was a stranger asking about it a fortnight ago. Just leaned over the gate and asked if the vicarage had any ground for hire. Said he was fond of gardening. I told him the Reverend didn't let the beds out, and he went away. Didn't think anything of it at the time. Did you notice what he looked like? Tall, dark hair, scar here." She touched her chin. "And a sharp sort of voice. Foreign, maybe. Not from round here, anyhow." It was the same description again. Whoever this man was, he had shown an interest in the garden well before Miss Truelove's death, and he had left the village on the very morning after her body was found. By the time Miss Marple returned to the limes, Inspector Briggs was waiting for her. He had a sheaf of papers in his hand and a grim look on his face. "I've had the lab look at that soil from the withered bed," he said without preamble. "It's loaded with salt, enough to kill anything that grows. And there's no sign it was accidental. It was done deliberately, probably over several days. Which means someone prepared that spot well before the body was placed there." Miss Marple nodded. A stage prepared for the scene to come. And the choice of the vicarage garden was clever. Who would suspect the Reverend of any part in such a thing? Briggs dropped into her armchair, tapping the papers against his knee. "We've traced our tall fellow to the inn. Paid cash, no luggage except that brown paper parcel. The landlord says he left early, and the bus driver remembers him getting off at Melchester. After that, nothing." "And the ribbon?" "We asked at the draper's. They sold a yard of sea green yesterday morning. The buyer gave no name, but he matches the description of our man. The assistant said he seemed in a hurry." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Then perhaps he realized the ribbon on Miss Truelove's hat had been damaged or removed, and feared it might be recognized. A new length could be sewn to another hat, or used to alter a garment, to confuse the matter. Briggs gave her a sharp look. You think the ribbon is the key? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that it is a thread, quite literally, that may lead us to the truth. And the truth will lie somewhere between Bath, the withered garden, and whatever copy Miss Truelove kept despite being told to destroy it. Briggs sighed. I'll send a man to Bath, see if we can trace that letter and who sent it. As for the copy, if it exists, it's not in her room. We've searched every inch. Miss Marple gave him a mild smile. Then perhaps it isn't in her room. People sometimes hide things in plain sight, among the possessions of others, or in places that seem far too public to be secret. After he left, she sat a long while in thought. If Miss Truelove had been in fear, she might have hidden the copy somewhere she could reach easily, but no one would think to look, somewhere she could retrieve it quickly if she needed it as a defense. Her eyes fell on the knitting basket by her chair, with its neat layers of wool and patterns tucked underneath. It was the sort of place a woman might hide a folded sheet without anyone thinking twice. But Miss Truelove had not been a knitter. What had she had with her everywhere? A handbag, certainly, but that had been found by the hedge. And Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Her hat. The felt hat with the sea green ribbon could easily conceal a folded paper stitched into the lining. If the hat had been snatched away and disposed of behind the cricket shed, perhaps it was because the killer had realized it held something dangerous. But the paper might already have been removed by someone who found the hat before Martin did. That evening, Miss Marple took a quiet turn around the green. Near the cricket shed, she examined the ground again, careful not to be seen. The boards where Martin had found the hat showed faint scuff marks, as if someone had been there in a hurry. And in the grass nearby lay a single petal, not from any flower growing nearby, but from an artificial bloom, flattened and smelling faintly of violets. She picked it up with her handkerchief and tucked it away. It was almost certainly from the same type of ornament as the cheap scent bottle in Miss Truelove's room. But it could also be from someone else's possession, someone who had handled the hat after the murder. The next morning she paid another call on Mrs. Carter. This time she came armed with a small box of shortbread, explaining it was a surplus from her baking. Mrs. Carter accepted it with a gracious smile, and Miss Marple let her eyes travel around the sitting room. On the mantelpiece was a wide-brimmed summer hat, trimmed with a cluster of artificial violets. How pretty, Miss Marple remarked. Such a lifelike shade. Mrs. Carter laughed lightly. Quite out of season, of course, but I do like a touch of color. Miss Marple leaned closer, as if admiring the craftsmanship. One of the violets was missing a petal. She straightened slowly. Have you had it long? Oh, a few weeks, Mrs. Carter said carelessly. I wore it to the Whitsun fete, I think. Why? No reason, Miss Marple said, her voice mild as milk. Only that it must be difficult to keep such delicate flowers intact. When she left, she felt the shape of the artificial petal in her pocket and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. It was not proof, yet, but it was another thread. And the more threads one had, the easier it was to unpick the neat sewing of a lie. She was beginning to think the motive might not be money at all. It might be something far older and more personal. Resentment, betrayal, the kind of injury that festers quietly until it finds an outlet. And Lydia Truelove, with her unknown copy and her habit of collecting confidences, might have stumbled onto something she could not have understood fully until it was far too late. Miss Marple knew the next step must be to draw the killer out, not with accusation, but with an opportunity to reveal themselves. And for that, she would need the help of Inspector Briggs, and perhaps a small gathering in the very place where the crime had begun. Inspector Briggs listened to Miss Marple's suggestion with the wary patience of a man accustomed to weighing her quiet pronouncements. They were seated in his cramped office above the constable's station, the air thick with the scent of ink and floor polish. Briggs leaned back, arms folded, his expression both doubtful and intrigued. "You're proposing," he said slowly, "that we invite everyone concerned back to the vicarage garden? On the pretext of what, exactly?" "A gesture of reconciliation," Miss Marple replied. "Mrs. Pemberton is a gracious hostess. She would gladly arrange a small gathering to thank those who assisted during the unpleasantness. People will talk, of course. They always do when they think the worst is behind them. And in talking, they will reveal themselves if the right topic is introduced." Briggs's eyes narrowed. "And you'd be the one to introduce it?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said mildly. "That would be far too direct. But a question put to one person within earshot of another. Well, it is surprising how often the wrong person answers." He rubbed his chin. "You've someone in mind, then? Someone you think might react?" "I have several someones in mind," she said, "but one in particular. And I suspect they are already uneasy, wondering what I may have noticed." It was settled that the gathering would take place on Saturday afternoon, with the vicarage lawn set with a few chairs and tables under the pear tree. Mrs. Pemberton, delighted to be doing something normal again, threw herself into the preparations. Word spread through St. Aldred's, as such things do, until even the grocer was remarking on how nice it would be to see everyone together after all that business. When Saturday arrived, the weather obligingly offered a warm breeze and mild sunshine. Miss Marple arrived early, ostensibly to help arrange the chairs, but in truth to take her measure of the garden. The withered corner was still roped off, a small rectangle of gray among the green. She noted who glanced at it and who avoided looking altogether. Mrs. Vane came first, in a simple cream dress, her manner composed, but her eyes shadowed. Next arrived Mrs. Carter, wearing the wide-brimmed hat adorned with the cluster of artificial violets. Miss Marple's gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on the missing petal, the absence all the more obvious now she had seen it before. The Reverend moved among the guests, offering iced tea and mild remarks about the weather. Martin Larch hovered at the edge of the lawn, plainly eager to be useful, while Mrs. Hardwick bustled between kitchen and garden with plates of sandwiches. It was Briggs who set the bait. At Miss Marple's suggestion, he waited until the guests were settled with their tea before remarking, in a tone of idle curiosity, "We never did find where Miss Truelove kept that letter from Bath, did we? The one warning her to destroy her copy." Odd that such a thing should vanish. Miss Marple, seated near Mrs. Carter, heard the faintest intake of breath, too small to be noticed by anyone not listening for it. Mrs. Carter set her cup down with exaggerated care, her fingers briefly tightening on the handle. Mrs. Vane looked puzzled. "I assume the police had it." "No," Briggs said. "We searched her room thoroughly. Now, if she had hidden it somewhere else, perhaps in something she carried with her, it might still be in the village." Martin Larch, emboldened, spoke up. "Could it have been in her hat?" The boy's question drew several glances. Mrs. Carter's hand went to the brim of her own hat, an unconscious gesture, quick as a blink. Miss Marple let the moment hang, then added in her mildest tone, "Hats are very convenient for hiding things. A small fold in the lining, a few stitches. One could conceal a paper quite neatly." Mrs. Carter's lips curved in a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Really, Miss Marple, you make it sound as though every woman's hat is a potential crime scene." "Oh, I shouldn't say every hat," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles moving calmly. Only those whose trimmings appear, suddenly altered or replaced, shortly after an unfortunate incident. It was then that Briggs leaned forward. We also found a hat belonging to Miss Truelove, behind the cricket shed. Sea green ribbon, frayed. It had been disposed of hurriedly. Curious, don't you think? Mrs. Carter glanced down at her lap, then back up with a laugh that rang a touch too loudly. Sea green. I should hardly wear such a shade myself. Miss Marple looked at her with gentle surprise. Indeed. And yet it would set off your eyes most charmingly, though perhaps you prefer violets to ribbons. For just a heartbeat, something hard flickered in Mrs. Carter's gaze, gone almost before it formed. But Miss Marple had seen it, and so had Briggs. The conversation moved on, drifting to the topic of the upcoming church fete. But the seed had been planted, and Miss Marple knew that the person who felt most threatened would not be able to leave it alone. Her expectation proved correct that very evening. She had just finished her supper when a knock sounded at her door. Opening it, she found Mrs. Carter on the step, the violet-trimmed hat in her hand. "I wanted to speak to you," Mrs. Carter said. "Privately." Miss Marple stepped aside to let her in. "Do sit down. Tea?" "No, thank you." Mrs. Carter placed the hat carefully on the table, smoothing the brim with her fingertips. "You've been hinting, quite artfully, that you think I know more about that girl's death than I've said. I assure you, Miss Marple, I do not." "I haven't accused you of anything," Miss Marple said gently. "I have only observed that you seem concerned." Mrs. Carter gave a short laugh. "Wouldn't anyone be concerned with gossip running wild? I have a reputation to think of. My husband's reputation." "And Miss Truelove worked for your husband," Miss Marple said, still mild. "She did, briefly, and she was too curious for her own good. She asked questions about things that didn't concern her, documents, old cases. My husband told her nothing, of course, but she may have thought otherwise." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And this copy she kept?" Mrs. Carter hesitated. "I believe it had to do with a will, an old case my husband handled years ago. Something disputed involving property in Bath. The original was destroyed, but apparently she had a typed copy. If it came to light, it could have caused considerable embarrassment to certain people." "Embarrassment enough to kill for?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Carter's eyes flashed. "You make it sound so simple. But you have no proof, none." She rose abruptly, snatched up her hat, and walked to the door. After she left, Miss Marple sat for a long while, considering. Mrs. Carter had given away more than she realized, not just about the nature of the copy, but about her own knowledge of it. And if she knew that much, she might also know where it had gone. Mardi Gras. Following day brought a note from Briggs. "Bath inquiry confirms will case. Family named Colston, property in Milsom Street. Dispute settled years ago. Carter's firm involved. Suspect link between copy and death. Need your insight." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had her own plan now, and it involved returning to the vicarage garden, not for another gathering, but for a quiet walk with Mrs. Hardwick. That afternoon, she called at the vicarage and found the housekeeper in the kitchen. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, "if you might show me where you keep the folding chairs you fetch for summer teas." Mrs. Hardwick led her to the small shed by the wall. As she opened the door, Miss Marple's eyes went at once to a dusty shelf above the chairs. Resting there, wedged between a watering can and a box of plant stakes, was a flat brown envelope. She reached up and took it down. It was unsealed, and inside was a single sheet of thin typing paper. The heading read, Last Will and Testament of Horace Colston. At the bottom, in a different typeface, was a note. Copy. Original destroyed. Miss Marple folded the paper back into the envelope. Mrs. Hardwick, did you put this here? Me? No, ma'am. I never go near that shelf. Reverend keeps his old bits there. Why? Miss Marple only smiled. Because, my dear, it seems the garden was not the only thing prepared in advance. She knew now that the killer had hidden the copy here before the murder, intending to retrieve it later once suspicion had cooled. But Miss Truelove must have told someone where she had placed it, or someone had seen her do so. And for that knowledge, she had died. The question that remained was whether Mrs. Carter had been the one to find it first, or whether another hand, perhaps the tall stranger with the scar, had been the true instrument of the plan. And to answer that, Miss Marple would need to set one last, careful trap. The trap Miss Marple envisioned was not the sort that involved locked doors or hidden policemen. In her experience, people who had lied successfully once often carried the lie with them like an heirloom, prized, polished, and occasionally brought out to show. The trick was to give them a reason to display it again, and to stand by, smiling, as the first hairline crack appeared. She arranged matters so the opportunity would present itself naturally. On Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Pemberton was to host a meeting of the church flower committee in the vicarage drawing room. Miss Marple, whose skill with arranging dahlias was quietly unmatched, was certain to be invited. So too, by tradition, were Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Vane. If one wanted to bring certain people into proximity without arousing suspicion, a flower committee was ideal. Miss Marple arrived a quarter-hour early, bearing a small basket of marigolds and lavender sprigs. For filling in the gaps. In the drawing room, Mrs. Pemberton was busy with the tea things, and Mrs. Hardwick had gone to the garden for more blooms. Miss Marple took a seat by the window, her knitting bag tucked at her feet, and waited for the others. Mrs. Carter came in first, immaculate as always, wearing a dove-gray dress and, to Miss Marple's quiet interest, the violet-trimmed hat once more. The missing petal had been replaced, not with a matching bloom, but with a slightly darker one, which only made the substitution more noticeable to the trained eye. She greeted Miss Marple with careful warmth, as though determined to demonstrate perfect civility. Mrs. Vane followed shortly after, bringing a small basket of roses. She looked tired, but her composure was intact, as the three women exchanged the necessary compliments on one another's flowers. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Carter's gaze flicker toward the window, where the roped-off withered bed was still visible. It was the look of someone taking an inventory of risk. Once the tea was poured and the vases brought out, the conversation settled into the usual pleasant nothings: weather, parish events, a forthcoming jumbles sale. Miss Marple bided her time until Mrs. Hardwick returned from the garden with a clutch of long-stemmed lilies. She set them down with a sigh. Still strange, that corner being so ruined, Mrs. Hardwick remarked, glancing toward the window. I'll be glad when the Reverend says I can dig it over. Gives me the shivers, it does, to think of. She trailed off delicately. Mrs. Pemberton, eager to shift from morbid talk, smiled at Miss Marple. You've such a way with arrangements, Jane. How would you fill a space like that, once it's healthy again? Miss Marple feigned thought. Oh, perhaps with tall white phlox to give height, and some trailing lobelia for softness. Of course, she added as if idly, I'd have to be sure the soil was quite free of remnants. Mrs. Vane looked puzzled, but Mrs. Carter's hand jerked slightly, causing her teaspoon to clink against her saucer. She recovered instantly, but not before Miss Marple saw her lips press into a thin line. Mrs. Hardwick, oblivious, carried on. The inspector was saying they'd found something tucked away in the shed, you know. Old papers. He wouldn't tell me what, but I expect it's nothing to do with the garden. Oh, papers can be to do with everything, Miss Marple said softly, especially if they've been hidden there before an unfortunate event. They do have a way of finding their way back to the person most interested in them. Mrs. Carter gave a quick, bright laugh. You make it sound like the papers can walk. Not walk, Miss Marple said, looking at her steadily, but they can be carried. Perhaps by someone wearing gloves, gardener's gloves, for instance, so as not to leave a trace. The silence that followed was very slight, but in it, Miss Marple saw Mrs. Carter's eyes narrow just for a heartbeat before she bent over her cup. That was the crack she had been waiting for. The rest of the meeting passed without further incident, but Miss Marple knew her trap had worked. Mrs. Carter would now be wondering exactly how much Miss Marple knew, and whether the inspector knew it too. An uneasy suspect is often a hasty one. That evening, she went to see Briggs at the constable's station. The envelope with the Colston will copy was on his desk, along with a typed summary of the Bath investigation. They've confirmed, Briggs said, that the original will was destroyed years ago after a settlement. But the existence of a copy could reopen the matter, call the settlement into question. Certain parties in Bath could stand to lose a great deal if it came out. Carter's firm handled the case, which ties him to it, and by extension, his wife. And Miss Truelove, Miss Marple added, had that copy. She likely thought it a curiosity, perhaps even a leverage of sorts. But to someone else, it was a threat. Briggs nodded. If Mrs. Carter found out the girl had it, and where she'd hidden it, that could be motive enough. Still, it's a long way from motive to proof. Which is why, Miss Marple said, we must let Mrs. Carter provide the proof herself. If she believes the copy is still in the shed, she may try to retrieve it, thinking the police have overlooked it. But you must make it appear that it's there. Briggs's eyes sharpened. A decoy. Precisely. Something to tempt her hand. And if she tries to take it, you'll be waiting. By Thursday, the plan was in motion. Briggs placed a sealed envelope, identical to the original, in the shed where Miss Marple had found the real one. A constable would watch from the orchard, out of sight. Miss Marple, meanwhile, made sure to drop a few pointed remarks in Mrs. Carter's hearing at the Thursday market. Remarks about how tidy the vicarage shed was looking now that the inspector had been through it, and how some things do slip past even the sharpest eyes. Friday evening brought a heavy, lowering sky, the sort that turns the air close and still before a storm. Miss Marple, from her parlor window, could see the vicarage garden's upper wall in the distance. Shortly after 9, a solitary figure in a light coat moved along the lane toward the vicarage side gate. The figure paused, glanced about, then slipped inside. She did not follow. There was no need. Briggs had men in place. Instead, she sat with her knitting and waited, knowing that the next knock on her door would bring the end of the matter. It came within the hour. Briggs himself stood there, hat in hand, rain beginning to bead on his shoulders. She took it, he said without preamble, slipped into the shed, went straight for the shelf, and pocketed the decoy. We stopped her at the gate. She claimed she was looking for an umbrella she'd left behind during the tea party. Miss Marple gave a small, dry smile. Did she now? Well, it's always useful to have an umbrella when one expects a storm. Briggs's mouth twitched. We've brought her in for questioning. She's denying everything, but with her in the shed, the envelope in her hand, and that hat of hers shedding violet petals all over the place, I don't think the magistrate will find her very convincing." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, letting the quiet settle. Then she asked, "And the tall stranger with the scar?" "Gone," Briggs said. "But we've got a lead from Melchester. He was seen in company with a man known to have done odd jobs for Carter's firm years back. My guess is he was meant to fetch the ribbon for Mrs. Carter, replace the damage before anyone noticed. Only he left too soon." Miss Marple nodded. People rarely keep perfect control over their accomplices or their hats. Briggs shook his head, half in admiration, half in exasperation. "You always make it sound so simple." "It is simple," she said. "Once you stop looking for grand conspiracies and start looking at human nature. A woman like Mrs. Carter prizes appearances, her marriage, her standing in the parish, even the symmetry of the flowers on her hat. She would never risk scandal unless she felt she must, and then she would take the most elegant means she could devise. Unfortunately for her, elegance leaves its own trail, petals, ribbons, little signs for anyone willing to stoop and pick them up." As Briggs left, Miss Marple settled back in her chair. The rain had begun in earnest now, tapping against the window like polite but persistent fingers. She thought of Lydia Truelove. Foolish, perhaps, in keeping a thing she didn't fully understand, but not malicious. The girl had been caught in the slow, careful machinery of someone else's plan. And the withered garden, ruined before it was needed, had been both hiding place and stage. In tending their flowers, people often reveal what they value most. In killing them, they sometimes reveal what they fear. By morning, the news would be all over St. Aldred's. Mrs. Carter taken in the night, the vicarage mystery solved. But for Miss Marple, the case had already closed, as neatly as the last page of a well-read book. What remained was only the small, private satisfaction of having seen each thread and known where to tug. And in her neat sitting room, with the kettle humming and her knitting restored to her lap, she began to think, not without a touch of curiosity, about what sort of flowers might thrive in a bed that had once been salted, and whether Mrs. Pemberton would take her advice about white phlox and trailing lobelia after all. The village of St. Aldred's woke the next day to a kind of eager, uneasy quiet. The quiet of a place holding its breath for the latest morsel of news. By mid-morning, the talk in the baker's queue had shifted from the price of flour to speculation about whether Mrs. Carter would be seen in public again, and by the time the church bell struck 11, there were half a dozen different versions of her confession. None of them entirely true. Miss Marple, sitting in her little parlor at the Limes, had no intention of adding to the embellishments. Truth, in her view, had a way of being buried under too many words. Better to let the police do their part and keep her own counsel until the matter was officially closed. She was, however, quietly curious to hear from Inspector Briggs. She had a feeling there was more to come. Her anticipation was rewarded in the early afternoon when Briggs arrived, bringing with him not only the satisfaction of a case nearing completion, but also a new piece of the puzzle. He settled into her armchair with the air of a man who has been walking uphill for some time. "She's admitted to removing the envelope from the shed," he said. "But she's sticking to the story that she only meant to keep it safe until she could give it to me. Says she found it by accident when she was helping Mrs. Hardwick move the chairs." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And do you believe her?" "No," Briggs said flatly. "She knew exactly what it was, and what it could do if it reached the wrong hands. We've traced the Bath connection further. That Colston will, if challenged, would have shown that part of the property was never lawfully transferred to the current owners. One of those owners happens to be Mrs. Carter's cousin. If the will came out, the whole thing would have been a scandal, and there might have been criminal charges for someone. Not her mind, but people she's loyal to. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Loyalty can be as dangerous a motive as greed, perhaps more so. A greedy person will weigh risks against gains. A loyal person will not count the cost. Briggs leaned forward. The part I can't yet nail down is exactly how Miss Truelove got hold of the copy in the first place. She worked in Mr. Carter's office. Miss Marple reminded him. A solicitor's files are full of papers that seem dull to the person who handles them every day. But to an outsider, they can be curiosities. Sometimes dangerous ones. My guess is she came across it while looking for something else, and finding it interesting, kept a copy. Perhaps she thought it harmless, or perhaps she thought it might be useful someday. Briggs gave a short laugh. Harmless. Keeping something like that was about as harmless as carrying a lighted match in a hayloft. Miss Marple permitted herself a faint smile. Indeed. And once Mrs. Carter learned she had it, likely through some unguarded remark, events began to move toward their inevitable end. He sobered. We've still got a hole in the timeline. We can place Mrs. Carter near the vicarage on the afternoon of the tea party. But we can't yet prove when Miss Truelove was killed. The doctor's estimate gives us a window between 4 and 5. Too many. People can account for their whereabouts only loosely in that hour. Miss Marple set her knitting down. I think perhaps you're looking for a moment that doesn't exist. If I'm right, Miss Truelove's death was not the primary purpose that afternoon. It was an opportunity seized when the circumstances favored it. The real preparation was done weeks before, when the garden was salted. That told us someone meant to have a hidden place ready and to have it in the vicarage garden, where few would suspect. Briggs regarded her thoughtfully. You think she was lured there? Oh, I'm sure of it. Likely by someone she trusted enough to follow, someone who could plausibly say they needed a word in private. She goes into the withered bed for a moment, perhaps to be shown something hidden there. And in that moment, Miss Marple's voice trailed off. Briggs sighed. And the tall fellow with the scar? A useful errand runner, she said. I imagine he was meant to tidy up a loose end, the damaged ribbon. But he left too soon, perhaps spooked by the village interest in strangers. There was a short silence. Outside, a cart rattled past, its wheels crunching on the gravel, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice. Briggs rubbed his chin. You've got the shape of it, I think, he said. We'll keep her in custody. The magistrates will have to decide if there's enough to charge her with murder or just with obstructing justice. Sometimes, Miss Marple said quietly, the moral verdict comes long before the legal one. St. Aldred's will not forget. After Briggs left, Miss Marple decided she might as well make a short visit to the vicarage. Mrs. Pemberton had been kind enough to send over a jar of her quince jelly, and it would be polite to return the favor with some of Miss Marple's own jam. It was a small courtesy. But in villages, small courtesies do a great deal of mending after an upheaval. She found Mrs. Pemberton in the garden, carefully deadheading roses. The withered bed was still roped off, though the police markers had been removed. Mrs. Pemberton looked tired but grateful for company. Such a dreadful business, she said, accepting the jar. I don't think I'll ever look at that corner of the garden the same way again. Do you suppose flowers will grow there next year? Oh, yes, Miss Marple said. Salt does leach away in time. With proper tending, the soil will be quite wholesome again. Mrs. Pemberton sighed. I keep thinking of that poor girl. She was so quiet. I can't imagine what quarrel anyone could have with her. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the roped-off patch. Sometimes quarrels begin in rooms far away, with people the victim has never met. She simply happened to be holding something that belonged to someone else's past. As she walked home, she passed Mrs. Vane's house. The curtains were open, and Mrs. Vane herself was at the window. She gave Miss Marple a small, acknowledging nod. There was relief in her expression, though also a lingering sadness. Miss Marple wondered if the relief came from knowing the matter was nearly over, or from knowing that she herself was no longer under the faint shadow of suspicion that had touched everyone in that small circle. By evening, the rain had cleared, and the air was soft with the scent of wet earth. Miss Marple sat in her armchair, knitting in her lap, and allowed herself to think of the case in its entirety for the first time without the constant sorting of fact from speculation. She saw again the chain of events, a document quietly kept, a will long thought destroyed, a woman whose loyalty to her family outweighed every other consideration, a garden salted weeks in advance, a ribbon torn and hastily replaced, a hat abandoned behind a cricket shed, an artificial violet petal carried on the breeze. None of these things alone would have been enough to prove anything. Together, they had formed a pattern too distinct to ignore. It was not, she reflected, a tale of greed for money so much as a tale of fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of the law, fear of losing a carefully maintained place in the world. Fear had driven Mrs. Carter to act, and it had made her careless in ways her pride would never have allowed under calmer circumstances. Miss Marple poured herself a small glass of sherry and sipped it slowly. Outside, the last of the daylight lingered, gilding the rooftops of St. Aldred's. In the weeks to come, the gossip would fade, the withered bed would be replanted, and life in the village would take on its usual rhythm once more. But human nature, Miss Marple knew, would not change. People would still covet, still resent, still cling to secrets they ought not to keep. And when they did, she would be there, knitting in hand, ready to see the threads for what they were. She reached for her notebook and wrote a brief line, the sort she often jotted down after such affairs. Preparation often tells more than the deed itself. Look for the ground made ready before the seed is sown. Then, with a small, satisfied nod, she set the notebook aside and picked up her knitting. The pattern was nearly finished, and there was comfort in the neat, predictable crossing of stitches, comfort in the order one could create when the world beyond one's parlor was so often disordered by human folly. Somewhere down the lane, a door closed, and the village settled into its evening quiet. The case of the withered garden was over, but Miss Marple's quiet watchfulness was not. It never was. 2 days later, the village seemed to have found its balance again, at least on the surface. The vicarage gates stood open, as they always had in more innocent weeks, and Mrs. Pemberton could be seen supervising the gardener in trimming the privet hedge. But if one lingered in the lanes, the conversations carried on over garden walls still carried the name Mrs. Carter like a burr clinging to cloth. Miss Marple knew from long observation that in small communities, scandal does not vanish. It settles. It becomes part of the soil, worked in with the gossip until it feeds the next crop of speculation. She suspected the Carter affair would linger in the same way a blight does. Its evidence not always visible, but always there. That morning, she received a brief note from Inspector Briggs. It was written in his quick, unadorned hand. Further developments. Might I call this afternoon? She placed it on her mantel and considered. Further developments could mean only one thing. There was a loose end still dangling, and in her experience, loose ends could unravel a neat case if not attended to. Briggs arrived just after tea. His face had the set look of a man whose work is technically done, but who knows there's a stone still unturned. He accepted a cup and drank half of it before speaking. "We've been going through Mrs. Carter's personal effects," he said. "Routine, though she's already admitted to the decoy envelope. But there's something else. We found a train ticket stub in her purse. Melchester to Bath. Dated 3 weeks before the murder." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. 3 weeks before. That would coincide rather neatly with the first signs of the garden's decline. Exactly. We've checked. She was in Bath for less than a day. The ostensible reason was to visit a cousin, but she called in at the old Colston property while she was there. No one knows why, but I'd put money she wasn't sightseeing. Miss Marple set down her cup. She may have gone to confirm something, perhaps to see for herself what the will's contents could mean for those involved. If she already knew Miss Truelove had the copy, the trip might have been to gauge the danger. It also means the salting of the garden may not have been her idea alone. She could have discussed it with someone in Bath who had more experience in arranging such things. Briggs frowned. "That brings us back to your tall fellow with the scar. We've traced him to a lodging house in Melchester, but by the time we got there, he'd gone. Left behind a pair of boots with clay on them that matches the soil at the vicarage. It's not proof, but it's suggestive." "Suggestive enough," Miss Marple said, "to make me wonder whether he salted the garden under Mrs. Carter's direction, or whether she hired him for something else entirely, and he took the liberty of preparing a place for his own purposes. Sometimes two interests meet in the same patch of ground." Briggs gave a slow nod. "If that's the case, we may have a second party out there with reason to keep quiet and to keep moving." "Which he will," Miss Marple said, "until he's certain the matter has been laid to rest. But such people have a weakness. They often believe they're cleverer than everyone else. He may return to see whether his handiwork is still standing." The conversation drifted to other matters: the magistrate's hearing, the likelihood of formal charges. But Miss Marple's mind remained on the idea of two overlapping plans. Mrs. Carter's, born of loyalty and fear, and another, perhaps older, one belonging to a man who salted a garden for reasons he never fully shared. That evening, she took a quiet walk along the lower lane, the one Miss Truelove had so often chosen for her evening strolls. The sun was low, and the hedgerows were thick with midsummer growth. As she reached the stile that led toward the cricket field, she paused. In the dust of the path beyond, a single heel mark stood out. A man's, narrow and deep, with a worn edge at the back. It was not new, but it was distinct enough to be remembered. She thought of the boots Briggs had mentioned and the clay on them. A man accustomed to walking certain paths will take them again if he returns, especially if he believes no one is watching. Back at the Limes, she wrote a short note to Briggs. Might be worth having a discreet watch on the lower lane and cricket field. A returning visitor may not be as careful the second time. 3 days passed without incident, though in the village the air felt faintly expectant. On the 4th evening, just as the light began to fade, Briggs sent a constable to fetch her. "We've got him," the young man said, looking both pleased and astonished. At the station, the tall, dark-haired man with the scar sat in a wooden chair, his expression that of someone weighing whether to bluster or stay silent. Before him on the table lay a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Found him coming from the direction of the cricket field, Briggs explained. He tried to say he was just passing through, but when we opened the parcel, he untied it to reveal a length of sea-green ribbon and, more tellingly, a small clasp knife with traces of dried earth on the blade. Miss Marple regarded the man with mild interest. "And where were you taking these?" The man shrugged, his eyes evasive. "Found 'em. Thought they might fetch something in Melchester." "Or," Miss Marple said softly, "you were keeping a souvenir of a job you thought no one would trace to you. The ribbon to remind you of the hat you removed, the knife for the earth you moved." He glanced at her then, the faintest flicker of recognition passing across his face. As if he'd heard of her somewhere, perhaps in connection with another matter entirely. But he said nothing. Briggs gestured to the constable. "Get him booked. We'll see if Bath police have a file on him." When the man had been led away, Briggs turned to Miss Marple. "This strengthens the case against Mrs. Carter. Puts her in league with someone who could do the actual dirty work. Whether she ordered the killing or just the garden salting, she can't claim she was entirely at arm's length." Miss Marple nodded. "It will also help to explain how the preparation was done without attracting notice. A stranger leaning over a gate to ask about hiring a patch of ground is unremarkable. A neighbor scattering salt would have been remembered. By the time she walked home, the sky was velvet dark, pricked with early stars. The village would sleep easier now, she thought, though the story would continue to be embroidered for years. In the telling, the tall man's role would grow until he was half villain, half scapegoat, and Mrs. Carter's cool hand in the affair would be softened or sharpened, depending on who was telling it. In her parlor, Miss Marple poured herself a small cup of cocoa and sat back, listening to the faint hum of the summer night. She reflected that, as in gardening, crime often involved more than one gardener tending the same bed for different purposes. Seeds sown by one could be harvested by another, and the ground itself, the scene, might serve both without either ever knowing the other's full plan. In the case of the Withered garden, the soil had been prepared by a man with no loyalty beyond his fee, and the deed had been done by a woman bound to her family's honor above all else. Miss Truelove had been the unlucky seed caught between them, sprouting in a place neither could allow to flourish. Miss Marple sipped her cocoa. She knew the law would now take its course, but she also knew something the law did not always acknowledge: that in the end, both Mrs. Carter and the scarred man would carry their own private verdicts, rendered not by magistrates, but by the inescapable memory of what they had done. And in St. Aldred's, life would go on. Flowers would be planted where the salt had burned the earth, and someone, perhaps Mrs. Pemberton, perhaps the new curate, would declare the garden restored. Yet to those who had seen it withered, it would always carry, beneath the bloom, the faint ghost of its ruin. The magistrate's hearing was held in Melchester a week later, and though Miss Marple did not attend, she had never cared for the cramped, stale air of courtrooms. News traveled swiftly back to St. Aldred's. Mrs. Carter was committed for trial on charges of perverting the course of justice, with the possibility of a further indictment should additional evidence tie her directly to Miss Truelove's death. The tall man with the scar, whose name turned out to be Leonard Pike, faced separate charges for trespass and obstruction, though the authorities in Bath were said to be taking a keen interest in his movements before and after the crime. The village, as villages do, settled into a new rhythm around these developments. In the shop queues, people shook their heads gravely and spoke of how it would all come out in the wash. At the post office, Mrs. Grover whispered that she'd always suspected Mrs. Carter knew more than she let on. While in the bakery, Mrs. Finch declared it a sad day for the parish, and immediately began calculating who would take over the Carters' pew at St. Aldred's. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was content to let the last threads knot themselves. She spent the first quiet morning in weeks at her garden table, shelling peas for her supper and listening to the summer bees. The case had taken the shape she had foreseen. Two converging schemes, one born of loyalty and fear, the other of opportunity and quiet malice. Neither Mrs. Carter nor Pike had planned for their paths to cross, yet the withered garden had brought them together in a common purpose: concealment. It was mid-morning when Inspector Briggs arrived, looking less harried than she had seen him in some time. He had a paper in his hand. "Just came from Bath," he said. "Pike's already admitted to salting the garden. Says Mrs. Carter asked him to make a patch nothing would grow in," her words. "Claims she told him it was for getting rid of a stubborn weed problem. But he's not fool enough to believe it. He insists he had nothing to do with the killing itself, though." "And you believe him?" Briggs gave a shrug. "I think he salted the ground for her and left it at that. But it made the perfect spot for hiding a body later. And he must have realized what she'd done when he heard the news. That's why he came back, for the ribbon, to see if anything had been left that might point to him." Miss Marple nodded. That would account for his interest in the cricket field, and for Mrs. Carter's sudden need for a new length of ribbon. One cannot very well wear a hat if its trimming has been recognized at a crime scene. Briggs smiled faintly. "Between the hat, the ribbon, and that violet petal you spotted, I'd say you had her measure before I did. The prosecution will have an easier time with her than they will with Pike. Still, the two of them together are enough to make the picture plain for anyone willing to see it." Miss Marple's expression softened. Poor Miss Truelove. She must have thought that keeping the copy of the will was a small thing, perhaps even a harmless bit of leverage. She could not have imagined the weight it carried for others. Briggs glanced at her. "Do you think Mrs. Carter meant to kill her from the start?" "No," Miss Marple said, shaking her head. "I think she meant to persuade her, perhaps frighten her into handing over the copy. But once Miss Truelove was in that garden, once tempers and fears were stirred, the opportunity was too immediate to resist. A quarrel, a blow, these things happen quickly when the ground has been prepared, both literally and in the mind." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the sound of the bees filling the space between them. "In any case," Briggs said at last, standing, "we'll see it through. I'll let you know the outcome, though I suspect you'll hear it before I do." When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her. Peas. There was a certain peace in such work, the small rhythm of pod and pea after the unraveling of human knots. Yet even as she worked, her mind turned over the curious irony of the affair, that the very qualities Mrs. Carter prided herself on, her composure, her elegance, her careful attention to appearances, had undone her. She had been too tidy in her work, too precise in her preparations. And in St. Aldred's, tidiness in the wrong place is almost as noticeable as disorder. That Sunday, the vicarage garden saw its first public gathering since the day of the tea party. Mrs. Pemberton, with the quiet courage of a vicar's wife, insisted on hosting the parish children for lemonade and buns, declaring that the garden mustn't be left to bad memories. The withered bed was still cordoned off, but the rest of the lawn was bright with chairs and laughter. Miss Marple attended, sitting with Mrs. Vane under the pear tree. The younger woman seemed lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted. "I suppose it's really over now," Mrs. Vane said, watching the children chase a ball across the grass. "In the sense that no more will be done about it here. Yes, Miss Marple replied. But such things never entirely end. They live on, in changed glances, in conversations that falter when someone enters the room. Still, life has a way of growing over them, much like grass grows over the bare patches left by winter. Mrs. Vane gave her a grateful look. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here, Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, I expect the truth would have come out eventually, but perhaps not in time to prevent more harm. Later that week, the roped-off corner was at last dug over. The salted soil, white and brittle under the spade, was carried away in barrows. Fresh earth was brought in from the churchyard compost heap, rich with the scent of humus and rain. Watching from the lane, Miss Marple thought it fitting that the place prepared for concealment should now be prepared for growth. As the gardener worked, Mrs. Pemberton came to stand beside her. I've decided on white phlox and trailing lobelia, as you suggested, something pure and something gentle, to make people think of summer evenings instead of, well, a wise choice, Miss Marple said. The following month brought the trials in Melchester. Mrs. Carter, faced with the combined weight of the circumstantial evidence and Pike's testimony, chose to plead guilty to obstructing justice. She was sentenced to a term of imprisonment and left the dock without a glance at the spectators. Pike, found guilty of trespass and destruction of property, received a shorter sentence, but was handed directly to the Bath police upon his release for questioning in other matters. In St. Aldred's, the news was met with a mixture of satisfaction and regret. Satisfaction that justice, of a sort, had been done. Regret that a woman so long a part of parish life had come to such an end. Life returned to its familiar routines, though the mention of sea green ribbon was enough to draw a knowing look between certain neighbors. Miss Marple did not trouble herself with the moral arithmetic of the court's decision. She knew that true justice rarely arrives in tidy packages. What mattered was that the danger was past, the truth was known, and the ground, both literal and figurative, was ready for something better to grow. On a bright September morning, she walked past the vicarage to see the new bed in bloom. The phlox stood tall and white against the wall, the lobelia spilling in soft cascades over the edge. Bees moved among them, untroubled, as though the soil beneath had never known the taste of salt. Mrs. Pemberton, kneeling to deadhead a flower, looked up and smiled. Do you think they'll take well? Oh, yes, Miss Marple said. They have strong roots now, and a garden, like a village, is very forgiving if you give it time and tend it properly. She walked on, her knitting bag on her arm, thinking that the village itself had begun its own quiet healing. The scandal would fade to the level of a cautionary tale, told over tea to newcomers. And when next she passed that corner of the garden, she would see not the withered stems and pale face she had seen on that summer evening, but the living proof that even the most blighted ground can bloom again. Autumn arrived in St. Aldred's with a gentleness that belied the stormy summer behind it. The lanes grew dappled with gold and russet, the hedges thick with late blackberries, and the air carried the faint wood smoke of first fires lit in cottage grates. To an unknowing visitor, the village looked as placid as the illustrations in a country almanac. But to those who had lived through the events of the withered garden, there was still a subtle shift in the undercurrent of things. Miss Marple noticed it most in the way people spoke to one another. Old acquaintances paused a moment longer before exchanging gossip, as though measuring their words. The Carters' former friends were careful to remark on the weather before broaching other subjects. And even then, only in tones that suggested the entire affair was something best spoken of in low voices, if at all. For her part, Miss Marple had no desire to keep the matter alive unnecessarily. Once the truth was known and the guilty were dealt with, she believed in letting the village breathe again. But the threads of such a case never quite fade all at once, and now and then a knot would catch her attention. One such knot arrived, quite literally, at her doorstep in the form of a small envelope with a Bath postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a neat, unfamiliar hand. "My dear Miss Marple, I hope you will forgive the liberty, but I believe you were concerned in the matter of Miss Lydia Truelove. There is something you ought to know. I cannot sign my name, but suffice it to say, I was once in the employ of the Colston family. Miss Truelove's copy of the will was not the only one. There is another, hidden somewhere in Bath, and those who feared the first will fear the second even more. I beg you to be cautious. The matter is not as finished as some believe." Miss Marple read it twice, folded it back into the envelope, and set it on the little table beside her chair. Then she reached for her knitting, not to work but to think. She knew from long experience that even the most cryptic message often concealed more in what it left unsaid than in what it told outright. If there was indeed another copy, then the stakes that had driven Mrs. Carter and Leonard Pike to act might still be very much alive. And someone might imagine that she, Miss Marple, had some knowledge of its whereabouts. Later that morning, she walked down to the vicarage under the pretext of delivering some quince jelly to Mrs. Pemberton. The vicar's wife greeted her warmly, though Miss Marple noted a certain preoccupation in her manner. Over tea in the drawing room, she steered the conversation toward Bath in a casual way. "Such a lovely city," Mrs. Pemberton agreed. "I visited once with my sister before I was married. We stayed near Milsom Street. Oh, and that reminds me, Reverend. Did you know there was another letter from Bath in the post this morning?" The Reverend looked up from his correspondence. "Addressed to me?" "No, my dear." "Not to you, addressed to Mrs. Vane," Mrs. Pemberton said. "It was redirected here by mistake. I sent it round with Mr. Appleby." Miss Marple tucked that away for later thought. She left the vicarage and took the long route home, passing Mrs. Vane's neat little house. The curtains were open, and Mrs. Vane herself was in the parlor, sorting through a small pile of papers. She saw Miss Marple at the gate and came out to speak with her. "You've heard about my letter from Bath, I suppose?" Mrs. Vane said with a wry smile. "It was nothing exciting, just an old friend writing about family matters. But I did think it odd to have anything redirected through the vicarage." Miss Marple murmured agreement. "Bath does seem to be sending us more post than usual these days." Mrs. Vane's smile faded a little. "Do you think there's still something left unfinished?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that certain matters have roots deeper than we first realize. And deep roots, as any gardener will tell you, are not pulled up in a single season." That evening, she wrote to Briggs, enclosing the anonymous letter. His reply came 2 days later. "Thank you for forwarding this. I'll pass it to Bath Police. Could be a hoax, but I'm not dismissing it. If there's another copy, we don't want another withered garden here or there." Weeks passed without fresh incident. Autumn deepened into October, and the village prepared for the harvest supper. Miss Marple found herself roped into baking one of her famous seed cakes, which she did with her usual precision. Yet, in the quiet moments, her mind returned to the letter. She could not quite shake the thought that someone, somewhere, might be making plans again, laying the groundwork just as carefully as the salting of the vicarage bed. One afternoon, as she crossed the green, she encountered Martin Larch, He was carrying a basket of apples for Mrs. Pemberton, but he paused to chat. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about Miss Truelove. She used to tell me funny little things about Bath, like she knew it better than someone who'd only been there a few times. She once said she liked the shops in Milsom Street because they're so near the solicitors' offices." I didn't think anything of it at the time. Miss Marple felt a small click in her mind, as though a puzzle piece had slotted into place. "Did she now?" "That's interesting, Martin. Very interesting indeed." That night, she took out the Bath letter again and read it by lamplight. If another copy existed, perhaps Miss Truelove had been trying to hint at it without quite daring to say so. And if she had known its location, then it was possible she had told someone. Just as she had told Mrs. Vane about receiving the first threatening letter. People who fear for themselves sometimes still cannot resist sharing the secret, in hopes that it will be remembered if they are not. By the end of October, the phlox in the vicarage garden had gone to seed, and the lobelia hung in faded strands. Yet, even in its decline, the bed looked healthy, the earth dark and crumbly underfoot. Miss Marple, stopping at the gate one afternoon, thought how different it seemed from the brittle gray of that summer. Restoration, she reflected, was a slow, deliberate thing. Much like solving a mystery properly. You had to turn the soil, clear away what was harmful, and only then could you plant anew. On All Saints' Day, a small parcel arrived for her from Bath. There was no note, only a folded scrap of cloth, sea-green ribbon, faded and frayed at the edges. Miss Marple held it in her hand for a long time, considering. It might have been a cruel joke, or it might have been a warning. Either way, it told her that somewhere beyond the boundaries of St. Aldred's, the matter of the Colston will had not been entirely put to rest. She put the ribbon away in a small box in her writing desk, alongside a pressed petal from an artificial violet. Two small tokens of a case that had begun with a withered garden and ended, so far, in a kind of peace. Yet she knew the story was not finished. In villages or in cities, roots run deep, and the ground is never as quiet as it seems. For now she let it rest. There was seed cake to bake, winter bulbs to plant, and the steady rhythm of village life to keep her company. But the knitting bag remained by her chair, and her mind, as ever, stayed alert for the next thread to appear, ready to be drawn out and followed to wherever it might lead. November in St. Aldred's had a way of folding the village into itself. The days shortened quickly, the lanes grew slick with fallen leaves, and smoke from the cottage chimneys hung in the still air. To most, it was a season for shutting doors early, for lamps lit before tea, for the quiet rhythm of winter evenings. For Miss Marple, it was also a time when memories seemed sharper. Small scenes from the summer replaying themselves unbidden. The trampled bed in the vicarage garden, the pale face among the stems, the salt white crust on the soil. The village, outwardly, had healed. The vicarage corner, once withered beyond hope, was now dark. Rich earth, lying ready for spring planting. Mrs. Pemberton spoke of snowdrops and early tulips. The parish hall was busy with preparations for the Christmas bazaar. Yet the name Mrs. Carter was still spoken with lowered voices, and Leonard Pike's brief, unpleasant presence remained the kind of thing people brought up when a conversation needed a jolt of drama. Miss Marple had thought often of the anonymous letter from Bath and the sea-green ribbon that had arrived so mysteriously. Both were tucked away in her desk, not forgotten, but not fretted over either. If there was indeed another copy of the Colston will, it was for others. Police, solicitors, perhaps certain Bath families, to contend with. She had no appetite for meddling in matters that might never cross St. Aldred's path again. Still, the thought was there. Seeds in the soil. dormant but alive. One cold afternoon, she walked into the village to deliver a pot of marmalade to Mrs. Vane. The younger woman greeted her with a smile that seemed freer than it had in months. They took tea in the small parlor, the fire crackling, the windows misted from the heat. "I wanted to tell you," Mrs. Vane said after a pause. "I had another letter from Bath. From my friend. It was nothing to do with, well, anything dreadful. Just a Christmas card and some gossip about mutual acquaintances. I thought you might like to know." Miss Marple smiled. "That's very kind. Letters from Bath have carried rather a weight of late. It's good to hear of one that doesn't." Mrs. Vane hesitated. "I suppose you must find it odd. How quickly we try to return to normal after something like that. Sometimes I feel as though we all agreed not to mention Lydia, and yet I keep thinking of her." "It's not odd at all," Miss Marple said gently. "We're human. We turn away from what unsettles us. But remembering quietly is its own kind of respect." Leaving Mrs. Vane's, Miss Marple walked the long way round, past the cricket field where Martin Larch had once found the crushed hat. The shed was locked now, its boards mended. A scattering of frost clung to the grass, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold earth. She paused by the stile and looked toward the lower lane, the one Lydia had favored for her evening walks. It seemed an ordinary stretch of path, but in her mind's eye she could see the summer light, the curve of the hedge, the girl's quick steps. Some scenes, once set in the mind, never fade completely. That evening, Inspector Briggs called, bringing with him the last word on the case. Mrs. Carter, he told her, had been moved to a prison nearer to her family. She had made no further admissions and no appeals. Pike had been taken into custody in Bath on unrelated charges and would not be returning to Melchester or anywhere near St. Aldred's for the foreseeable future. "That's as much closure as we're likely to get," Briggs said. "The rest, well, if there is another copy of that will, it's someone else's problem now." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes the best we can do is tend our own garden, Inspector. The weeds in other people's plots will still grow, but not under our noses." Briggs gave a wry smile. "You and your gardens, Miss Marple. I don't know how you do it, seeing patterns in soil and flowers that lead you straight to people's secrets." "It's the same principle," she said. "Plants and people both grow according to their nature. If you know what to look for, nothing they do will quite surprise you." They spoke a little longer about village matters, the bazaar, Mrs. Pemberton's new rose cuttings, before Briggs took his leave. When the door had closed, Miss Marple stood for a moment in the quiet, the ticking clock the only sound. Over the next weeks, the village turned itself toward Christmas. Boughs of holly appeared in cottage windows, the church choir practiced carols in the cold nave, and the shopkeepers began their seasonal good cheer. On Christmas Eve, Miss Marple attended the candlelit service, her voice joining softly in the familiar hymns. The vicarage garden, she noticed as she passed, lay peaceful under a thin dusting of snow. The seasons would turn again. By spring, the phlox and lobelia would flower, and perhaps no one but she would remember what had once been buried there. But Miss Marple would remember, not with morbid satisfaction, but with the quiet certainty that even the most tranquil places can hide tangled roots. She returned to the limes after the service, the air crisp and still, the stars bright above the dark rooftops. Inside, she lit her lamp, poured herself a small sherry, and took her knitting to the fireside. As the steady rhythm of the needles began, her thoughts drifted, past the summer's mystery, past the withered garden, to the simple contentment of a warm room and work in hand. Outside, St. Aldred slept. Inside, Miss Marple worked her row, knowing the peace was real enough for now, and that when the next small ripple disturbed it, she would be ready. The frost clung stubbornly to the hedges, and the morning Miss Marple decided it was time for a last visit to the vicarage. She had promised Mrs. Pemberton some advice on the spring planting, but there was something else she meant to do. A final tidying of the case, like smoothing the coverlet on a well-made bed. Mrs. Pemberton greeted her warmly, leading her through to the drawing room where the low winter sun caught the silver tea service. The Reverend joined them for a polite quarter hour, but when he was called away to the study, Miss Marple took the moment she had been waiting for. "Mrs. Pemberton," she began, her tone conversational. "You've always been very kind in sharing your garden. May I ask, when the police were in and out during the investigation, did they ever search the tool cupboard by the kitchen door?" Mrs. Pemberton looked mildly surprised. "Why, yes." The inspector glanced inside. "But it's only where Mrs. Hardwick keeps the smaller things. Secateurs, gloves, string, that sort of thing." "And the gloves," Miss Marple said. "Would they have been there all summer?" "Yes, of course. Mrs. Hardwick is most particular about her tools. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled. "Because that is where Mrs. Carter slipped, quite literally, when she took them to handle the envelope from the shed. You see, she feared leaving fingerprints on the paper. But in using gloves already dusty from the garden, she left behind particles that matched the salted earth exactly. The inspector didn't need that for his case. But I think it matters to know for certain." Mrs. Pemberton gave a little gasp. "You mean you knew all along?" "I knew," Miss Marple said gently, "when I saw her glance at that cupboard during the tea party after the discovery. People's eyes are very honest when their tongues are not." That afternoon, Miss Marple carried the last of her thoughts to Inspector Briggs. In his office, she laid it out plainly. How Mrs. Carter had learned from a casual remark that Lydia Truelove possessed the copy of the Colston will. How she had gone to Bath to confirm its danger. How she had engaged Pike to prepare the garden. And how, on the afternoon of the vicarage tea, she had lured Lydia into that salted corner under pretense of showing her where something had been hidden. A blow, perhaps struck in anger, had finished the matter. The rest was concealment, removing the hat, ordering the ribbon replaced, hiding the envelope in the shed for later retrieval. Briggs listened without interruption. "It fits," he said finally. "Every bit of it. You've tied off the last loose end." "It's always best to finish the row," Miss Marple said, with the faintest twinkle. "A dropped stitch will work its way back eventually." When she left the station, the winter light was already fading. She walked home slowly, the air sharp and clean, her breath a small cloud before her. At the limes, she lit the lamp, set her kettle to boil, and opened her knitting bag. As the needles clicked in their steady rhythm, she let the case settle into the back of her mind. Justice had been served, not with grand speeches or courtroom drama, but with the quiet inevitability of truth finding its way to the surface. Mrs. Carter would live with the knowledge of what she had done. Pike would think twice before taking another small job in a village. And Lydia Truelove, though gone, would not be quite forgotten. Outside, the frost thickened, whitening the garden. Inside, Miss Marple worked her row, content in the knowledge that St. Aldred's could rest, until, as always, the next ripple disturbed its calm.